If you find yourself asking that sort of question, the answer is no, because then it's become debatable or it's become unclear, and that's not what the AMC wants.
Alex back for some more MCAT podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
Hello, hello. Ready to dive into some discrete questions.
Discrete. So we are covering the Diagnostic from Blueprint MCAT, which everyone gets for free at blueprintmcat.com. I repeat, blueprintmcat.com. Free, so many free things. That's the one thing I always mention. I love Blueprint MCAT because they have a similar kind of philosophy in terms of like free stuff for students. I'm going to provide value for you. And I know a lot of you aren't actually ever going to spend money with me. That's okay, as long as I'm helping you. And so we do this podcast. They have, with their free account, the study planner tool, the flashcards, the half-length diagnostic, the full-length test. So many amazing things.
I used this very podcast. I used the full-length 10 run-through from ages ago. I think you were working through it while I was studying for my MCAT, and I listened to every episode.
Wow. It's a full circle. And look at you now. So basically what you're saying is you owe all of your success to me.
I think if you listen to every episode of the MCAT podcast, you are statistically in a bucket in which very good MCAT scores are highly overrepresented.
There we go. You heard it here first, folks. Alex owes me a quarter of his salary for the rest of his life in perpetuity. All right, so
an MCAT tithe.
We're in the half-length diagnostic again, covering. We just have done the first two passages, and now already on to the discrete questions. The first discrete set here. So let's go and dive in here. I'll read question 11. Which of the following explains why the pitch of persons' resonant voice harmonics, seems like it's missing an A in there. Pitch of a person's resonant voice harmonics rises when they inhale helium instead of air. A, the wavelength increases due to the change in temperature from the helium atoms. B, the change in timbre results in a higher perceived frequency of the voice. C, the frequency decreases due to the change in air density from helium atoms. Or D, the speed of sound wave remains constant regardless of changes to the medium through which the sound wave propagates. So I've done questions, so I'm cheating a little bit, I think, potentially, because I've done some sound wave questions before here on the MCAT podcast. And I want to say that the sound wave remains constant. I think this is a tricky-ish question because we want to go, helium, there's air density changes in helium. I'm going to pick C and move on. But I think I'd be wrong because I think the frequency increases. So I'm going to pick D just because I think I'm getting tricked here.
So this question illustrates a really great kind of strategic point on the MCAT, which is to say that right answers for these kinds of questions, they need to be right.
For the right reason.
They also need to answer the question.
Yeah.
And I think of this, I put this question in the bucket of it bamboozles people with fancy words. But when you look at them, only one of them actually relates to the question being asked. And the question is asking, why does the pitch of someone's voice rise, right? Why does their voice sound higher?
Aha.
And if we read A, B, C, D, only one of these actually relates at all to the pitch or the frequency of someone's voice, which is B. The change in timbre results in a higher perceived frequency of the voice. Like, this is a lot of, fancy words. But if we were to rephrase that, it's effectively saying their voice sounds higher.
Yeah.
Like, kind of, B is practically saying, the higher frequency makes it sound higher. And the question is saying, why does their voice sound higher?
Darn it. All right.
If we look at D, the speed of the sound wave remains constant. This doesn't quite relate to the frequency of the person's voice, but at any rate, it's actually not true anyway.
Okay.
The speed of a sound wave varies depending on the medium. It's why it's why, for example, have you ever heard sound travels 4 or 5 times as fast underwater as it does in air?
Yes. I have. Okay, yeah.
Different materials, depending on a bunch of factors, their density, something called the bulk modulus, their temperature, all of those will affect how quickly sound waves will propagate through them.
Okay.
And it's why something like air has a relatively slow speed of sound, while something like diamond has an incredibly fast speed of sound.
Okay. What about a vacuum?
Of course, sound is the propagation of vibrations through atoms.
Yeah.
So if there are no atoms, there's no sound.
No sound. So when I'm floating out in space all alone, nobody will hear me. All right. Going to question 12. Go ahead.
The figure below shows the pressure and volume changes of the left ventricle during the cardiac cycle for 2 different patients. Which of the following is true? I mean, Ryan, you're the medical doctor here.
I know. I'm like, shoot, I better get this one right. Okay. Some physiology stuff. Go ahead and read the answer choices.
Yeah, so we have which of the following is true. A, we have the change in systolic pressure in patient 1 is greater. B, the change in diastolic pressure in patient 1 is greater. C, the work done by patient 2's left ventricle is greater. And D, the work done by patient 1's left ventricle is greater.
So we're looking at relatively same relaxation time, contraction time. The difference is an increased filling time and an increased ejection time. So answer choice A, the change in systolic pressure is greater in patient 1. The change in systolic pressure. Change from what? I'm confused. The change from what? So the figure shown below shows the pressure and volume changes. So pressure, all right. Okay.
I would choose to interpret this as the change in pressure during systole.
Yeah. So looking at left ventricular pressure, I said right at the beginning, the relaxation, contraction stuff, those look relatively the same. Relatively. So I'm going to ignore A and B because the pressure stuff to me on both the relaxation side, which is diastolic, and contraction side, which is systolic, I'm going to leave those out because they look almost identical perception-wise. The graph is drawing us to the longer filling cycle, which increases the volume and the bigger ejection. So I'm going to go with C and D. C, the work done by patient 2's left ventricle is greater. So the work done, how much work is done? How much blood is being pumped out? Theoretically, if I have a longer filling cycle, my volume increases, I'm doing more work. Patient 2 is that, and I'm going to go with that without even looking at D.
Exactly right.
Woohoo! The doctor still got it.
I would quibble with your explanation slightly. You say longer filling time. The axes on these graphs is volume and pressure.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily know anything about the filling time. I don't know. Maybe patient 2 is like working out, so like the flow rate. I don't know.
True.
Maybe the filling's happening kind of just faster. Oh,
Yeah.
or maybe it's happening at the same rate, but just at a higher like volume flow rate.
That's true. I added time, but that's not relevant at all because it's not on the graph.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. The work done by patient's left ventricle is great. Absolutely. I mean, if the relative pressures are the same, but it's moving more blood, then it's doing more work.
So here's an interesting thing. I was confused at the very beginning when I was reading the change in systolic pressure in patient 1 is greater. I didn't know what it was talking about because I didn't read the X and Y like graph, what the X and Y titles were.
Ooh, always important.
I was just looking at the box with the heart and the arrows. I didn't actually look at how they were labeled. So once I realized that, then I'm like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Exactly. And I think what's helpful here is that, even if you're not sure, like, oh, which one's systolic or which one's diastolic, well, if we look at the axes that's marked pressure, well, I would just say, well, it looks like the values are pretty comparable for both. I mean, it seems like they both kind of rise to the same height and sink to the same depth.
Yeah. I was starting to get a little worried because I was nitpicking. I'm like, ooh, I can actually compare the reflection, the E, it's actually above the E there. But on this one, it's kind of middle E. I'm like, oh, they're going to get us, aren't they? But they didn't.
and that's a great point. I think often people approach the MCAT and think to themselves, like, I think this often comes up in like biochemical techniques where, they're looking at a Western blot on the MCAT and they're saying, and they think to themselves, or I think I've had students before who are very worried about the fact that, what if I get a Western blot on test day and, I have 35 minutes left in the biochem section and I'm there squinting at a black and white scan of a Western blot, thinking to myself, is that a line? Or am I just imagining it?
Yeah.
Right. Is that line any darker? Or is it the same? And I think it's always worth noting that this is a standardized test. The AMC, kind of just for the integrity of this test, needs to have answer choices which are clear and unarguable.
Yeah.
So stuff like this, like, is the ejection slightly higher on the right if I squint and pull out a ruler? If you find yourself asking that sort of question, the answer is no, because then it's become debatable or it's become unclear, and that's not what the AMC wants.
Yeah.
I think of this as the moment you feel your brain contorting into gymnastics, you're probably not going down the right path.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. No contortionism or whatever that word is. All right. Question 13. In the figure below, the black line represents an enzyme catalyzed reaction, and the gray line represents that same reaction after adding 0.05 millimolars of factor X. Factor X can best be described as A, a non-competitive inhibitor, B, an allosteric activator, C, a competitive inhibitor, or D, a chelating agent. So we have figure below, the black line. So I would argue that Blueprint needs to change from the black line and the gray line to the solid line and the dotted line, because these lines are pretty darn close in color to me. I'm assuming this top line is the black line. So enzyme catalyzed reaction. The gray line represents some reaction after adding the factor X. And so we get to the same point, but it takes a little it just changes the curve. It looks like we get there at the same point. Non-competitive inhibitor. I would cross that out because it's obviously competing for something because it's slowing the reaction down, I think. An allosteric activator, I don't necessarily knows what that means. A competitive inhibitor, potentially, right? It looks like maybe competing because it's going slower, differently, something. Or a chelating agent. I'm just going to say, because it looks like it's going slower to me, I'm going to say competitive inhibitor and move on because I'm not really sure what the other words mean.
Great strategy, which is to say if you're not sure what the words mean, pick, and there's one that seems pretty good for you. Don't waste loads of time puzzling it out even more, particularly for a question like this, this is effectively a I think the AAMC calls it a skill 1 question, which is to say, do you know scientific principles? I think of skill 1s as effectively fancy flashcard questions. Do you know the definition of this term? And can you apply it in a context that is probably very similar to how you learned it in the first place? C is the correct answer. Well done. And
yeah.
I highly recommend flashcards. So this is an enzyme kinetics question, and there are lots of kinds of enzyme kinetics and inhibition. In this case, there are kind of 2 quantities that we want to pay attention to when we look at a enzyme activity versus concentration graph. And in this case, the concentration of the substrate is on the x-axis, and the kind of activity of the enzyme is on the y-axis. In this case, the black line represents it by itself, and the kind of maximum value, what you described as it kind of gets to the same place in the end, kind of the maximum number of reactions that this enzyme is catalyzing per second. This quantity is often described as Vmax. So this is one of the quantities that we want to be aware of. The second quantity is called Km, which is defined as the substrate concentration required for this enzyme to achieve half of its Vmax. That is to say, to get to kind of half of its maximum activity. In this case, all of the different inhibitor types for enzymes will affect these 2 quantities in different ways, depending on how they work. So a non-competitive inhibitor, this would lower the Vmax, so it would lower the kind of maximum number of reactions per second that this enzyme can catalyze, but it wouldn't affect the Km at all. Non-competitive inhibitors bind an enzyme at a site which isn't its active site.
Yeah.
Allosteric activator, if it's an activator, it would increase the enzyme's activity, and we can see here the gray line, it's kind of lagging below the kind of normal enzyme line. So this, the gray line is definitely an inhibitor of some description. So we have C, a competitive inhibitor. This binds the enzyme at the active site, and a kind of classic feature of competitive inhibitors, I like to think of them as kind of, if you add enough substrate, you can eventually get the enzyme to where it would have been normally anyway, which is what's happening here. A competitive inhibitor increases the Km, because of course the Km is the concentration required to get to half of its activity. Yep. So if you partially inhibit it, you need a higher concentration to get that same level of activity. Yeah. But it leaves the Vmax unchanged, because if you just drown the enzyme in its substrate, it'll get up to its original activity level eventually.